Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, The Arab Uprisings, A Decade On. In this webinar, we are trying to um, revisit this major event in the region, trying to make sense about the features of new reality created after the Arab uprisings at different levels, at geopolitical level, at regional political level, at even the theoretical level. And the idea here that we need to think about the continuity and rupture, what is now is part of the new reality in the region, and what are the other things that represent the continuity, of course, maybe in different forms from the past of the region. So this is like the major themes that we will address in our webinar today. We are so lucky to have many prominent leading experts in this and the scholars in this topic. Mr. Waddah Khanfar, the president of Sharq Forum, Professor Larabi Sadiqi, professor of Arab Democratization at Qatar University, and Dr. John Kean, the professor of politics at the University of Sydney. I'm sure that they have very important and very deep insights about the Arab uprisings and the changes that they created in our region. So of course, now we are live streaming on our social media, Sharq Forum social media, but also for those who are following us on Zoom, there is Arabic translation. Please make sure that you have an access to the Arabic channel. And we will start with three key speeches, 15 minutes each, and then we will open the floor for questions. So without any further delay, I will ask Mr. Waddah Khanfar, the president of Sharq Forum, to start his speech, which is about the Arab Spring and the legitimacy crisis of the Arab state. Mr. Waddah, the floor is yours.
Yes.
So, where is Mr. Waddah? Did he left? It seems so. Should we wait until his return, or should we? Yeah, it seems that yeah, the internet. Okay, so we'll start with Dr. Larabi. Okay, Dr. Larabi. We will start with Dr. Larabi Sadiqi, professor of Arab Democratization at Qatar University, who will follow the ways of knowing the Arab uprisings and how this experience contributed to the debate on democracy at theoretical level. So when we start with Dr. Larabi, please. Yeah, please unmute yourself, Dr. Larabi.
Okay. Fantastic. I guess really it's a wonderful opportunity to share this platform with Ustaz Waddah and Ustaz John. This is really, it's with the humility that I share this platform with them and I address you on the question of Arab uprisings. I guess really from the outset, what I'd like to state is, to talk about the nature of the discourse on the Arab uprisings. Since 2011, across many fields, political science, democratic transition, social theory, Middle East politics, declare the uprisings revolutionary or democratic, or exactly the opposite. That is what I call winterized. And you notice the really the volume of work being done on the Arab winter. And I wonder why. Okay, so there you go, the uprisings relegated to counter-revolution and authoritarianism. Both democracy and revolution belong to core concepts within the social sciences. And they do not only lend themselves to variable interpretations. We know that we can contest democracy, we can contest democratization, we can equally contest revolution. And because of that, they defy coherent theorization, especially when transposed across boundaries of language, geography, culture, history, and politics. And it makes really the field intellectually stimulating and exciting because of this travel of these core concepts. So in this context, perhaps it's opposite to discuss some of the tensions, challenges involved in the mammoth task of intellectualizing both, that is revolution and democracy, whilst trying to grapple with questions of theory and practice. Remember, likely one of those challenges always, is like, to reduce the gap between theory, how we read things, understand things, conceptualize them, and then the empirics that inform how perhaps, we revise how we understand theory and democracy. So what is certain is that the events of 2011 have inspired challenging agendas of reflection and research across the board, north and south, within the social sciences, generally, and more specifically, politics, democratic transition, social theory, etc. So really here we have, I guess, really scholars are triggered, this term, they face intellectually and morally compelling questions about how to interpret questions of change, dignity, freedom, and despotism. They're equally triggered to probe not just the dynamics of change, its ideational, structural, maybe moral, normative underpinnings. They're equally and more importantly forced to return to looking into the roots of democracy. Okay, where does democracy begin? Where does revolution begin? Where does Islamism begin? And even terrorism, which really has been at the backdrop of all of these events in the context of the Arab Spring. So thus far, the exercise at hand seems, at least in my case, is one of seeking to ponder the new vistas we can open up in order to bring to bear on this discussion the full force of ontological, methodological toolkit of reading and rereading the Arab uprisings. Because really you always you get the feeling that they have finished and now we are actually post-revolution, post-Arab uprising. I beg to differ. On this question. So I see the misgivings of rendering the uprising in a reductive fashion. Really, there's like this, we are awash in reductionism by describing them via post-type analyses. So the longue durée is accordingly compromised. 10 years is only a footnote in the history of nations, or overdoing functionalism in understanding the uprisings. The key focus is the function of these uprisings. And that really leads to teleology. People overdo the teleological model of political transformation, of reading political transformation. Nor is it easy to lean, let's say, on a Marxist lens to examine the socioeconomic angle of such transformations in context of peripheral capitalism, and here I'm invoking Samir Amin. So à la Moore, we go back always, Barrington Moore, we have to go back, to the founding fathers, the grandees of the field, who have informed us about the origins of democracy and dictatorship. And one thing that is really so striking, this phrase, pretty sure like says Wazah and says John are familiar with, no bourgeoisie, no democracy. My gosh, how do you interpret that in an Arab context? What if you don't have a bourgeoisie? Can that hold true in impoverished Tunisia or Yemen? And you notice here that the books written on the Arab uprisings, I think thus far have been either silent on these questions or really superficial. There's not really much that speaks to this question of, let's say, structure. What are these structural underpinnings? Can we replicate the kind of questions that more Skocpol, Tilly, and others, have referred to in their understanding and excavation of how to read revolutions and uprisings? So I guess really all of us know that this region we call the Arab Spring region has historically featured as a contributor to Euro-Med cultures and civilizations. Professor John has got fantastic work on the life and death of democracy, and he has done so much on this interconnection between East and West, etc., like the exchanges, cultural, intellectual, etc. Mesopotamia, Egypt, Phoenicia, all at one point in time or another mediated processes of infusion, inclusion, and diffusion of democratic learning, let's say, cultural learning. So the flow was never one way, yet we are really at this historical juncture dealing or grappling with the questions, and you get the feeling that the learning is a one-way street. Okay, so in a way, like indigeneity, the indigenous, the locals are yet to have their inscriptions on the Arab uprising done properly. What I see, lots of books on the revolutions, and really it's chronicles of the Arab uprisings, not really hardcore social science, political science scholarship. So the travel of ideas left lasting inscriptions on this geography, especially the cultural map. For instance, North Africa enters its democratic or phase of revolution moment. It's opposite, I guess, to address the question of democracy and democratization and trans-democratic exchange. Is that possible? This is really one of the key questions that we have to ponder. This question is noted by glaring omission in most accounts of the uprising since 2011. So this moment registers continuity as much as rupture. It's a moment opportune for a break, encouraging the unshackling of the region from post-colonial histories of tutelage from without. Okay, and here I guess really we can really talk about the interface between internal and external forces, variables, etc., and discourses as well. Yet at the same time, it renews the ethos of exchange, concomitantly unmaking North Africa as a space of exile, exception, and otherness, and remaking it as a shared space of democratizing ferment, democratic exchange, and diffusion of, let's say, democratization. So the democratic moment is additionally confused by the ontological and epistemological postulates, assumptions, and theories of Western transitology. The clamor for closure, that is like taming the revolution, taming the Arab uprisings, the obsession with consolidation, and the temporal and spatial specificity of the Western experience all define the realities, perhaps, of the Arab Middle East. And I'm really posing this as a question. So the air of superiority, evidenced by many Orientalist writings on the Arab Middle East, continues to prejudice the terms of how West meets East in relation to democratization. So when West meets East, in relation to democratization, of course, contrast and difference reign supreme. So really, we have not actually moved beyond, the Orientalism that Edward Said, so ably talked about. Okay, So the West here is privileged as the sole source of all knowledge of good government, whilst the East or Orient is paired with West only for the convenience of constructing mirror images. So Orient is invented to highlight and celebrate by way of contrast what the West is and is not. And hence you see, like, you know, in the context of talking about the Arab uprisings, you know, the narratives about Yemen, Libya, Egypt, Syria, you know, this winterization, you know, the Arab winter discourse narrative, you know, in a way speaks, you know, to this critique. So really here, in such mirror images, the non-West is marginal to rationality, peripheral to theory, and on the sidelines of knowledge making. So really here, it's what type of knowledge making. This relates, you know, to my observation earlier about epistemology. What type of epistemology can we actually engineer to be able to do better scholarship, better social science in reading the Arab uprisings? So many accounts of polity and society in this region generally expose the survival of this line of thinking. Western transitology displays the prejudicial position of the Occident as the knower of democracy. There are two reasons. Alternative possibilities for locating instances of democratic learning or apprenticeship, democratic struggles, and democratic discourses are largely omitted or ignored as serious contenders for systematic study. And I think really this one-way street that democracy basically, you know, resides or is situated only in one geography, I think really is problematic, at least, you know, for some of us who think like the exchange is yet, you know, to happen. You know, if people are able to engineer a revolution, and some of the, let's say, mantras of the indignants or the protesters happen to be about freedom, you know, dignity, freedom, etc. Then there is like reason, you know, to consider what the other, the Arab other has got, you know, to offer in terms, you know, of how to recondition thinking about democracy and democratization. So notwithstanding the persistence of the presuppositions of this transitology, there have been concerted efforts to break from its stranglehold. So scholarly journals and books have been published acknowledging the indigenous capacity to drive change. Many of these focus on the sociological dimensions of popular mobilization, the globalizing effects of social media in the Arab Spring. So really you've seen the overdoing of the romanticization.
كل هذه الأمور ولكن بطريقة رومانسية على الفيسبوك وتويتر وكأن هناك هندسة.
Or they actually make revolutions. You know, and here like the agentic, you know, we talk about the normative, we talk about the organizational, we talk about the ideational and agency, the agentic variable is very important. And lots of the time it's really occluded, you know, from discussions of how to read, you know, the nexus between revolution and democracy within this context. However, what is conspicuously lacking...
Sorry, we have only 3 minutes remaining.
Sure. However, what is conspicuously lacking in these otherwise astute accounts is the synergy, and this is really what interests me, the synergy created between the West and the East. That is the capacity of our publics to self-consciously draw on the resources, not just of social media, but also of the broader repertoire of democracy, freedom, and human rights. So previous attempts to study the Arab Spring have identified the empirical facets of its unfolding without duly recognizing the theory espoused by participants. Further, the critical application of a meta-theory to political change away from autocracy to democracy in this region is seemingly absent. And I think this is really one thing, you know, to keep in mind for those of us who claim to be transitologists. So the East, and for this matter, you know, the Arab Spring geography is not just a workshop, it's not a lab where experimentation with the ideas and theories invented in and by the West takes place. So the polarities and the litter, the polarities that litter the narration of democracy's global trouble should not be framed in either Orientalist or Occidentalist terms. So the democratic moment through these revolutions, I think, have heralded and has necessitated cross-pollination, and that is what one may call the ethos of pluralism, good government, democratic identities. So all of this defies being boxed into a single location, into a single paradigm of knowledge, into a single ethnicity, into a single region, and into also a single religion or civilization. And I will leave it at that. Okay, thank you indeed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Larabi, for these deep insights. I think 3 points here are worth mentioning. First, the problem of the approach, the appropriate approach to address and to deal with the Arab Spring phenomenon. Secondly, the issue of when the phenomenon started and when it ended, because we can't really pinpoint an end point for the phenomenon of Arab uprisings. And so it's very hard to define the phenomenon clearly. And third is the problem of exceptionalism, dealing with the specific culture or specific region in the lens of exceptionality. That they are not part of, and they can't come up with their own model of democracy, their own model of inclusiveness and good governance. So I think these 3 major issues really are important, and I think during the questions and answers we will have room for more discussion. So then we will move to Mr. Waddah Khanfar, the president of Sharq Forum. He will highlight the issue of the problem of legitimacy of the Arab state in the light of the Arab Spring. So Mr. Waddah.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My first argument for today is the following. The Arab Spring is just a step in the path of a perpetual quest of the Arab peoples to achieve a legitimate political entity in their land, or entities in their land. And I argue as the following as well, that the Arab state, since its inception, since independence, is suffering from inherent deficit of legitimacy. And that because of the fact that the Arab states, especially in the eastern part of the Arab world, has been established from the beginning on foundations that were basically not the priorities of the people of the region, neither as a continuity of the DNA of the region. I call that state that was designed by the French and the British as the Dawlat al-Qati'a, the state of discontinuity, the state of separation. And that state, which we did not have a say on its borders or on its even political structure, has been introduced to us as a beginning without history, without depth. So the Ottoman Empire, which was a continuity of something bigger than that, before that, which was representing a sense of ummah, has been introduced to us as colonialism, and therefore the new state has been established as a new entity, a modern entity, but this modernity which was imposed on it was basically designed by Western powers to serve Western interests without taking into consideration the social or political or demographic continuity in the region. So it is a state without memory, and it is a state to a large extent without continuity, and therefore there was from the beginning an issue of legitimacy. And this is what led the Arab peoples in this region, especially in the eastern part of the Arab world, again, the Levant, Iraq, Syria, and the rest of the region, to revolt always against the state. We have experienced in the Arab world more than 123 coups in order to establish a new order. Now, some of these coups succeeded, some of them did not, but most of them were military coups. Now, Of course, we did have also one or two attempts to change reality through civilian demonstrations, like what happened in Sudan, and that did not also materialize properly because of the hegemonic nature of the armies in our countries. But the Arab Spring introduced to us a unique attempt by the Arabs themselves, especially the youth, to create a legitimate and at the same time a proper structure for themselves. Yes, we could not achieve that in reality because of major reasons, you know, all of them, especially the counter-revolutions, the silence of the West, and even the support of Western powers of coups that happened against the Arab Spring. But to a large extent, that moment in the Arab Spring has proven to us in this part of the world that we are capable of generating a discourse, a narrative, and a proper, you know, framework whereby it could describe the ideal reality for us in political and social reality. It was a moment that went beyond ideology, went beyond sectarianism, went beyond religious belonging, and it became something unique that was born out of necessity, but to a large extent described as well the choice of the people for their future. So the Arab state itself has had, you know, few pillars where it did actually sideline democracy as a major choice. And people were, to a large extent, trying to cope with this state for many reasons. One of them is that chaos and the fitna that could be created by the lack of order creates, of course, a lot of complications in a region which is a mosaic of sects, religions, ideologies, and also belongings, ethnic belongings. So therefore, people wanted the state to function. It means that the Arabs did not want the state to collapse. And this is what gave the state, to a large extent, a room to go beyond what is actually possible to be tolerated. So at the beginning, it was the independence. We sidelined, or the Arab state sidelined, the issue of democracy and the freedoms for the sake of fighting against colonialism. And mostly military institutions at that age were in power, and they introduced to us priorities of independence, which are very important, and they put them above freedom. And therefore, people would, to a large extent, sometimes sacrifice their freedom for the sake of independence. But we found that the concept of independence was wanting because it was not delivered to us as we have wished it to be, because it was built on foundations, as I said, of a state that did not have the belonging to the priorities of the nations in this part of the world, or to the continuity of cultural, political, and historical memory of people in the region. So that was a major pillar, which in my opinion was shattered to a large extent because the state itself became nothing but a tool in the hand of Western interest, Eastern and Western to a large extent, over the Cold War, and later on after the Cold War, when the American hegemonic nature became very visible in most of these countries. The second pillar, where we tolerated the concept of the lack of freedom, was Palestine. The state introduced itself, especially after 1948, as the protector of the national aspirations of the Palestinians and the Arabs of liberating Palestine. And therefore, to a large extent, that was an excuse, again, to establish a military rule in most of the Arab countries. And that was actually a reason for a lot of people to put Palestine above also major demands of freedom. And the state succeeded to an extent of sidelining democracy for the sake of Palestinian struggle. And of course, that has collapsed totally, because we see that the current state in the Arab world is not at all close even to recognize the Palestinian rights. And we see the last phase of normalization that we have witnessed during the last few months, in my opinion, the end of that particular argument. And therefore, the state has lost the second pillar of its legitimate, or although it is like partial legitimacy. The third one is delivery. The Arab state wanted to deliver, services and goods to the public. And we know every state needs to deliver on education, needs to deliver on health, and needs to deliver on various systems to the public. The current Arab state has reached the end of that. At this moment of our history, we occupy the highest rate of unemployment in the world. It goes up to 36.2% of young people are not employed. This is the highest figure in the world. And we also have reached the highest figure of corruption when it comes to the public funds, basically, manipulated and also stolen by officials. I think our land is the highest in the world, and the figures of that are very clear. And number three, we are the highest in lack of democracy. 10 years ago, when the Arab Spring started, we had about 5,000 to 6,000 prisoners in the jail of Hosni Mubarak regime. Today, we have more than 60,000 in the jails of Sisi regime. During 10 years ago, we had regimes that were at least had resources to cover up for the lack of legitimacy and freedom. Today, the economic contraction has reached levels that are very threatening, on average of 4.2%, and it goes up to 19.5% as it is in Lebanon, 9.5% in Iraq, which is an oil-producing country. So therefore, the state is now losing the third pillar of its partial legitimacy, which is its ability to deliver. I would like to also share with you a very scary figure that most of the employees in the Arab world, the highest number of percentage of the state employees is in the Arab world. In a country like Iraq, we have about 8 million employed by the state. And the state today is suffering from a major deficit and economic contraction, which in my opinion will lead to a large problem for the state. And this could be a beginning of another phase of Arab struggle for achieving, some form of balance in their land, which in my opinion is going to be a difficult one, is going to be maybe chaotic. It could be a revolution of the hungry in our land. And I would like to add to that currently the political powers, it means the opposition parties that in 2010, 2011 were to a large extent present, although they were opposition and they were persecuted, but at least these organizations existed. And when the Arab Spring happened, they did move on to lead and to organize. I am afraid that with this new phase, we may not have this also tool of leadership, because it has been, most of the political parties have been either imprisoned, exiled, or weakened to a large extent. And therefore, I'm not very optimistic about what could happen to the state in the Arab world. But we have reached an end of 1 century of humiliation, in my opinion, and 1 century as well of chaotic political transition that did not reach a final stability. We are the result of the total collapse that happened in the First World War. And we still trying to figure out how could we establish a regional order or even national order that could achieve political stability or economic sustainability. Both of these are not achieved yet. And our state has introduced itself as the guardian of our nations, but they failed to achieve independence, proper independence. It means the priorities of the state are not the priorities of the people. It did not achieve the most important national target of the Arabs in certain phases, which is Palestine. And the third one, the concept of delivery, is actually now collapsing to a large extent. But to end with a positive note, I would not say that the Arabs themselves are actually a nation that has reached a dead end. I think we have proven to the world that our people have great talent of describing what exactly they would like to achieve and working for it. And when the state was not an obstacle, as in the case of Tahrir Square and the case of Tunisia, a brilliant discourse emerged from this chaotic, bleak reality. So my opinion on this matter, that the state is an obstacle, although the absence of the state as well led to civil wars in certain areas in the Arab world. But looking forward, we have no choice but to start developing a framework that could survive the aftermath of the chaos and create a reality which could emerge as much more stable politically, more legitimate as well, and much more sustainable economically. Once we move into that framework, we abandon the concept of loss, of the feeling that we lack hope, and the feeling that we are definitely heading towards disaster. We are heading towards reform. And that reform might be sometimes painful, but eventually it's going to succeed, because I am banking on the great reservoir of legitimacy that nations and peoples have, their history, their ethical framework, their concept of pride, and their concept of self-respect, which in my opinion will lead eventually to something much more stable at the end of this painful path towards democracy and freedom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Addah. Also, a very deep and very important insights here. Arab Spring as a manifestation, as a symptom of legitimacy crisis in the Arab world, and how legitimacy crisis has two aspects. First, at the moment of foundation, when the newly formed states and newly formed regimes do not match the continuity of socio-political structures in the region. And second aspect is the performance crisis, when the state failed to deliver its promises on independence, on solving the Palestinian issue, and even to deliver social functions. So also I think we will get back again to the issue of legitimacy. But now the third speaker, Professor John Kean, Professor of Politics at University of Sydney, who will address the issue of the Arab uprisings using 5 keywords: joy, disappointment, despotism, remembering, and hope. So the floor is yours, Dr. John.
I will unmute myself. Yes. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, Doctor. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, very good. So a warm salam to everybody. It's Masa el Khair for most of you. It's late evening for me down here in the Southern Hemisphere. I wanted to thank both Wada Khanfa for his remarks and also Lavi Sadiki. A great pleasure to be with both of you as friends and colleagues again. And also a very warm shukran and salam to Mohammed Afan, who has so generously and so professionally put together this webinar. This topic of the Arab uprisings is a serious topic. This white guy is going to say a few things about this topic, and I want to do it in an unusual way by summarizing my thoughts, tentative thoughts about these uprisings 10 years after them, by drawing on 5 words: joy, al-bahka, disappointment, al-ihbot, despotism, al-tughyan, remembering, al-zikra, hope, al-amal. It's an unusual way to probe, to ponder, as Labi Sadiki has appealed for. It's an unusual way to probe the complexity of these events, but let me first try. First, joy, al-bahja. When I reflect on a decade ago, we held a symposium here in Sydney. There were many events globally. When I think back on these events of early 2011, we can say that they were without precedent. They rocked regimes practically everywhere in the vast swathe of territory stretching from Morocco through Egypt to the Gulf states, to the Levant, and beyond to Iraq and Iran. These events transformed the lives of millions of people. We know from that period that often for the first time, men and women jumped, they danced, they kissed strangers, they sang in the seats. It was if the whole of the Arab world had won the World Cup. And there was much talk of dignity, of justice, of freedom, of democracy. And dictators and ruling groups scrambled for a time. What were the elements that fed this sense of joy during this period? Striking for me, pondering these events, was the extraordinary uncertainty of lives and situations in that period. These uprisings injected a strong sense of freshness into many people's lives. They became different people. The blood in their veins, if you like, flowed more freely. They hungered after free speech. They heard things with different eyes, and they saw the world through different ears and eyes. There was striking, I think, feeding this joy, a strong refusal of violence, a disciplined refusal of violence. During that period, trying to make sense of these uprisings, I drew upon a word that had come out of Central Eastern Europe: revolutions. Revolutions. The idea was that historically, for example, the French Revolution were power grabs, the attempt to occupy the institutions of state power using violence, and usually terror was a feature of revolutions during the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries. These were different in the sense that there was an organized refusal of violence, at least in the early stages. Demonstrators chanted slogans like "No more fear," freedom, justice, Allahu Akbar, of course. There was the sense that these uprisings could draw the poison of state violence. And very striking, I think, was the publicness of this resistance and the occupations that took place during this period. The tyrant president of Yemen in the early months of 2011, Ali Abdullah Saleh, likened the ruling of Yemen and Arab states to, as he put it, dancing on the heads of snakes. I think this simile was entirely mistaken, because what was striking about these uprisings is I think that they were victories, at least temporarily, for the theory and practice of al-Mujtama al-Madani, for civil society. Previous revolutions involved the storming of Bastilles, the occupation of post offices, of telecommunications buildings, etc., etc. These upheavals, in fact, rejected the principle of seizure of state power. Instead, the tactic in the early weeks and months was the occupation, the establishment of public spaces. And this was true in Boulevard Habib Bourguiba, in Tahrir Square, in Pearl Square, in Bahrain. And it also took place, we should recall, in the Syrian city of Homs, where tens and thousands of protesters took to the streets and occupied Clock Tower Square. They pitched tents. They declared their intention to stay, with the whole world watching, with citizens chanting, a sit-in, until the government falls. There was a strong sense that of not being lured into the tactics of state violence. That is, a strong sense that if the regimes lured the uprising into violence, these regimes would win. These public places were gatherings of the afraid. They had an aesthetic dimension. There was poetry, there was music. Labi Sadiki wrote beautifully about these events during this period. They were, of course, multimedia events. They were what I've come to call digital mutinies, and they had global effects. For example, think of the huge crowds in Alexandria in Egypt that watched themselves live on satellite television, calling for the end of the dictatorship. These were also, I think, the joy that came from these uprisings happened because they were rebellions against pauperization. The events of 1989 in Central East Europe were different in this respect. These uprisings of 2011 were probably the biggest rebellions we have seen against what has come to be called neoliberalism, against the injustices of market-dominated societies. And finally, as a source of joy, I want to just put on the table for discussion the whole phenomenon of what has been called, which I tried with a colleague of mine to talk about, religious secularity. This is an oxymoron, but these were not rebellions, uprisings in favor of French-style secularity, of laïcité. They were mixtures, so to say. The spirit was predominantly a mixture of the spiritual and the worldly. They defied that dualism. For example, in the early days of the uprisings in Syria, church bells rang during Muslim funerals. We have many recorded images of veiled and unveiled women standing shoulder to shoulder with bearded and clean-shaven men protesting on the streets. We have the example of Rashid Ghannouchi saying very early on, and I quote, "We have continuously defended the right of women and men to choose their lifestyle. We are against the imposition of the headscarf in the name of Islam, and we are against the banning of the headscarf in the name of secularism or modernity." To understand that requires a break with so much democratic thinking, both contemporary and also classical. For example, Tocqueville's account of North Africa, of Morocco and Tunisia, where he supposes that democracy cannot happen in Islamic societies. These uprisings showed that it was possible to find, so to say, a new language of resistance that was religiously secular. Secondly, disappointment, al-ihbot. It's been a decade of broken dreams. Both Labi and Wada have already mentioned this. I will not say so much. In some cases, Yemen, Libya, a long nightmare. We could say that the old proverb from the French Revolution, like Saturn, revolutions devour their children, applies also to these revolutions. There are many broken hearts, and Wada has just given us some figures about the misery that continues to feed the disappointment from those months of 2011. In 2011, there were approximately 8 million people in the Middle East and North Africa living below the poverty line of $1.90 per day. By 2018, according to the World Bank, that number had increased to 28 million, from 8 to 28 million. The region, Wada has mentioned this, has the highest youth unemployment rate in the world. And I accessed recently a survey of young Arabs between the age of 18 and 24, half of whom say that if they had the opportunity, they would leave their country. This is symptomatic of this disappointment. And this applies also to Tunisia. Unemployment is at least 15%. Growth rates are sluggish. And it seems that this is a dynamic that feeds the disappointment. Meanwhile, in Syria, we know at least 6 million people have fled their homelands. We have coups d'etats and military repression, as in Egypt and Bahrain. We have proxy wars that are the immediate consequence of these uprisings of 2011 in Libya, Haftar, supported by Egypt, for example, in Yemen, where disease and famine stalks at least 14 million people, about half the population. We know that 60% of the more than 250,000 Yemenis who have died are children aged under 5. That all bodes ill for the future. Third,
Professor John, I'm sorry,
yes,
we have only 3 minutes.
Fine, so I do my 3 points in 3 minutes. Third, I want to say 55 seconds about the problem of despotism, al-Tughyan. I have recently published a book on this subject, and it's difficult to summarize in a few seconds, but what I want to say is that if you look at Saudi, if you look at MBS's Saudi, you see that one possibility that emerges from the events of 2011 is a new kind of despotism. State-controlled, top-down power, state capitalism, lots of talk of the people, media saturated, rule through law, the camouflaging of violence, the great gap between rich and poor, and yet regimes that that actually may manage to attract a certain measure of loyalty, a kind of voluntary servitude. It's something to think about. What is clear is that these despotisms, about which I have written, China, Russia, Vietnam, Hungary, the list goes on, are antithetical to democracy. Fourth, second to last point, remembering al-Zikra. I want to say in just a few seconds that if you look back at the history of democracy, you will see systematic attempts to obliterate the memory of events of the kind that happened beginning in 2011. This is an idea of Nicole Leroux, the great French scholar. It is, you may know, an old joke. It was actually the joke of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's right minister of propaganda, who said that the biggest weakness of democracy is that it hands the possibility to its enemies to destroy it. Actually, we could say that worse than that, the enemies of democracy take advantage of attempts to obliterate memories. This webinar is a contribution to remembering, and remembering of events is hugely important for the future of democracy. Finally, I want to say just a few seconds worth about hope, al-amal. Things look bleak. Wada Khanfar has emphasized this, and yet the spirit of democracy that infused the events of 2011 remind us that democracy has a wild quality. Claude Lefort's idea of a sauvage quality of democracy. That is, when the spirit of democracy takes root among people, flesh and blood people, it induces the sense of possibility. They learn that the way things are not necessary, that things can be changed, that things can be other. And in this sense, democracy is the carrier of hope. It stirs up the sense that what exists today doesn't necessarily have to persist, and that things in future can be different. It helps to stir up insurrections, as in the unfinished Sudanese revolution. If I had time, I was going to quote to you Abu al-Qasim al-Shabi's The Tyrants of the World, a young Tunisian poet, but maybe I save that for the end. So these are 5 words to help perhaps make sense of very complex developments which are not finished and which deserve our wonder, deserve our appreciation, because millions of lives are dependent upon the continuation of unfinished business. Shukran. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor John. Of course, these 5 words were very successful in capturing different feelings, scenes in the long trajectory of Arab Spring through 10 years. So now we will open the floor for questions. I have many questions here in the chat. So the first question, I think it's very important to start with this question about why did the uprisings not succeed in totalitarian regimes? In some cases, like Libya or Syria, why the situation there deteriorated to be civil war and the collapse of the state? So anyone want to step in and answer this question, or?
Yes, maybe I will try to just give it a quick answer. You know, the Arab state, as I have described, is basically based on military to a large extent. The armies in the Arab world were the most important actor since independence. And as you know, armies do not have that kind of great positive attitude towards political diversity or participation or transparency. And therefore, the centers of power in the Arab world were not the society or societal, institutions. It was the military and its security agencies that held the state over decades as authoritarian regime. So when the Arab Spring happened, the Arab Spring is the movement of the people and its forces, the people and the political parties who did not have actually that equivalent power of the army and these security agencies, and they did not have also the support of the international society or the wealthy nations in the Gulf states who stood behind the military in every Arab country. Now, I can't say it is a failure. What I would say that the first phase of change did not reach its final conclusion because of the factors I mentioned, but also those who have went against the Arab Spring, the counter-revolutionary forces, did not succeed either. Today, we cannot say that the counter-revolution forces have succeeded because all of them are in continuous crisis, continuous weakness, and the most important, they have major deficit in providing hope for the future. And people will continue always to demand freedom and democracy, and they're going to continue demanding dignified life, which I think the current counter-revolutionary forces are not capable of providing. So therefore, I won't say that we have seen the end of the dream. I think we are still into it, and the final phase is not written yet.
Thank you. I think.
Can I, if you don't mind, is it possible to?
Sure. Yeah. Three of you. Okay. Great.
I actually happen to agree with Ustaz Waddah on this, but I'd like also to add that this question is really a very good question because it raises, I guess, other questions about the so-called the concept of silmiya. Is silmiya enough to engineer a revolution? A revolution that basically creates, in the words of Hobsbawm, the rupture between the past and the present, or the past and the future. And I guess really when people think of silmiya, they always tend to be drawn into thinking in terms of antonyms, that the opposite of silmiya is violence. They don't really think in terms of what Deleuze called assemblage, assemblage of power. That means that you've got this complex, which is multi-scalar. So it has, let's say, moral power. It's got organizational power. It's got intellectual and ideational power. And I just really like, to just branch out into an example which may corroborate what I'm trying to say, which regards the Iranian Revolution. What you had during the Iranian Revolution, you had an exiled leadership, I guess really pivoted around Imam Khomeini, and he was basically the ideologue, conducting the ideational, the moral, etc. And then on the grounds, you had a Hirak, which was basically in charge of engineering protest and revolution, etc., etc. So really, for me, I guess conceptually, epistemologically, we are really facing a very difficult question about, this notion of silmiya. Is silmiya enough to engineer revolutions, and how can we basically catapult al-Hirak into reorganizing itself so that it has this, or amasses the skills of an assemblage. So it's got the ideational, it's got the normative, it's got the agentic, organizational, etc., etc. So you cannot just really rely, on the guns, and you say, oh, that's it. That's how I can actually change, society. That's all.
Thank you, Dr. John.
Yes, just very briefly, I wanted to say several things in reply to this very, very important question. Deep time matters. Every recorded rebellion of this kind, whether these were revolutions or revolutions or uprisings, historically, the working out of their effects takes a very long time. French scholars debated well into the 20th century whether the French Revolution had come to an end, for example. And these are early days. So I think premature conclusions should be avoided. You know, why did they not succeed? Let us wait. Let us see what happens. This is the first point. I agree, secondly, about the incapacity of violence to rule. Adam Michnik, who is a friend and colleague, once said about the Polish coup d'etat in the early 80s, that the problem with militaries is that they cannot sit on their own bayonets. I mean, it's a joke. And in this sense, Chairman Mao was wrong. You know, political power does not grow from the barrel of guns. Actually, political power, well, Hanfa has said it beautifully, comes from the consent of millions of people who authorize it. That is the most durable form of government. By contrast, armies are always at a disadvantage, no matter how powerful, so to say, they look. And then thirdly, finally, the transitology literature, which Labi has spoken of, I mean, has for far too long been riddled with American liberal democratic presumptions, you know, that the world should become like America. This is, of course, it's become, you know, an embarrassment for American scholars as to what is going on in the United States. But I do think that if you look at the very final writing of Jamal Khashoggi, he points out that actually not elections are central, but what is central to defeat dictatorships, violent military-dominated dictatorships of the Arab kind, is the building of a civil society. The attempt to build a plurality of institutions that can operate at arm's length from government, and that includes media platforms that can circulate stories, so to say, to millions of people. The Tunisian case, although it's not paradise, shows that that strategic importance of civil society remains on the agenda. The defeat of these corrupted, incompetent, violent, dignity-destroying regimes can happen through the formation, in whatever way it can, through the mosque, through trade unions, through households, through the formation of digital platforms, forms of resistance to that power.
Great, thank you. Actually, I have also a very important question, and it will be great if I hear your take on, three of you on this question. It's about the important difference between the situation in 2011 and the current situation, the case of the situation of democracy in the West. Now, in this question, there is a crisis of democracy in the West, instability of leadership, loss of power of Western state to protect its citizens. So the question here, what impact will the crisis of the West have on the crisis of the Arab state? So yeah, it will be great if I have also a response from three of you.
I think the demand for democracy in the Arab world is not a result of a Western planted concept, although to a large extent, the concept of democracy in the West during the phase of rhetoric, when Western powers were promoting democratic transition, and a lot of people believed that, that was shattered by the action of the West in reality. And luckily, after the Arab Spring, after the counter-revolutions in the Arab World 2013, the rhetoric even stopped. I mean, I can't even hear anyone at this stage in the Western democracies describing or demanding proper democracy in the Arab world. I mean, I think they sacrifice that for the sake of another paradigm, which they call security, which in my opinion is fake as well. So I think the need for democratic transformation, for dignity in the Arab world and the freedom is authentic, is natural, and it is organic. And whether the Western powers are declining when it comes to democracy or whenever there is contradictions, I think we are going to learn from that rather than just moving away from it. Maybe our dictators will feel more empowered. The authoritarian regimes do feel much better when someone like Trump is ruling the administration in the United States of America, or whenever right-wing parties are elected in various countries in the West. But when it comes to the people, I think it is a very genuine and serious, continuous, and legitimate demand that will continue regardless of what is going to happen around us. We will be affected by it, no doubt about it. But the failure of the Arab state to provide even a minimal level of participation or pluralism or even respect of people's opinion. I mean, right now, it is not, as also Jamal Khashoggi said one day, which was a brilliant statement, our struggle is not even about freedom of speech. It is freedom of silence. In some countries, you are not free to be silent. You have to be full of praise for the authoritarian entities that we have in our land.
Thank you. Dr. John?
Yes, the story of the fate of democracy in the West is of rising importance. There are many things to say about what is happening. It's an excellent question. I would just like simply to put on the table a single and provocative thought, perhaps a surprising thought for the questioner, which is that there have been 3 democratic empires in the history of democracy: Athens, revolutionary France for a brief period, both were defeated militarily, and the United States. And if you look at the lineaments of the American empire, I think the evidence is surfacing that it is shrinking and it is in decline. This is the story of China. It's a work that I'm now doing on the birth of a new global empire of the Chinese. And this is bad news for Democrats everywhere. It poses the question of how will the spirit and substance of democracy survive without American support. American support, of course, was always conditional. In the end, they supported al-Sisi. And there is a double standard in the history of the rise of the United States in matters of democracy, but the decline of the American empire must be part of the equation for thinking about the future of democracy. I wanted to say one very brief thing about what is democracy. Among scholars, there is a tendency to reduce it to free and fair elections. It's not my view. I think it's historically very questionable. So far, to come to the point, we've not mentioned the word equality. I mean, the very idea in its origins, probably Eastern origins, that then percolated through the Greek world. The idea of democracy is bound up with the idea that people are good enough to govern themselves as equals, and that there should be no tyrants or despots or autocrats or monarchs, because the consolidation or concentration of power in a few hands is dangerous. Democracy emphasizes the importance of the problem of arbitrary power, that if power is not constrained, dispersed, if it is not subject to the equality dignity principle, then it will be abused. And the abuse of power can produce foolish decisions, but also great evils. This is the point of democracy, of its spirit, of its substance. It is not a liberal or American conception. It has, I would say, a definite universal quality. And if you don't believe that, then you have to perforce believe in the principle of good kings and queens. And I wish you luck with that principle, because we are living in the 21st century. And the problem of good kings and queens principle is that they love power and they abuse their power. And they heap great indignity on people. This is the core idea of democracy, and its spirit is alive in the region we're discussing, and its fate is still yet to be determined, in my view.
Yeah, wonderful stuff. Like to reflect on really brilliant interventions from Wadah and John. I guess what I want to add is that, and definitely it's really a challenging question, to rise to. It is the crisis of democratization that concerns me more than the crisis of democracy, because as John and Wadah, I guess, really have explained, when you talk about democracy, it's like the delayed project, which we don't know when it's going to happen. Everyone tries, to do a very good approximation of democracy, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is when you have crisis of democracy in the West, it more or less it is refracted in the East through, in my view, securitization of processes of democratization, and that really can corrupt, those processes, fledgling processes of democratization, and that's actually really happening in lots of places. So really, the security agenda overtakes everything, overwhelms everyone, and it becomes actually prioritized over civic engagement, over what John said, this ideal quest for equal representation of difference, if that is, what can be understood by democracy. This is really a problem. But locally, the problem becomes what? Becomes really when finance gets really implicated into politics, who actually, and I think that is really, really dangerous, really dangerous. It narrows basically the space of free speech. It can actually dictate who speaks and does not speak. So it creates really new classes of subalterns. And for me, that is the most dangerous thing, when you've got basically a fragment of the powers that control speech. That is really dangerous. And that really happens in lots of, let's say, the developing part of the world, where you've got projects of incipient democratization. So really the linkage between the crisis of democracy in the West and how that basically impacts on the crisis of democratization in the West is, for me, really a problematic. Thank you.
Thank you. The question here for Mr. Wadah about the problem of legitimacy. What do you think the pillars for a new legitimacy will be? Is it possible for a reformist path to build a new reality on a legitimacy that is both organic and stable?
First, I do believe that none of our Arab countries, in particular in the eastern part of the Arab countries, and even in North Africa, none of them on its own is capable of achieving full legitimacy as far as the pillars that I mentioned. I think the concept of continuity has to emerge back into our conversation. I think a form of geopolitical center should be established whereby it could support our political entities in the region to take decisions far from the Western interest. In my opinion, the current reality from an economic point of view and from a geopolitical point of view is impossible to achieve a state that is functionally capable of delivery or capable of envisaging priorities and interest of its people. And therefore, I am thinking that some form of architecture should emerge whereby minimal, minimalizing actually the impact of borders and maximizing the integration. And this is not impossible to envisage. We have the European Union as a great example that I think we should study and try to take the positive aspects of it. We have many other also organizations that attempted to achieve something like that. And we need to direct our attention, especially those who are thinking about the future of the region. The civil society organizations, think tanks, and even political entities who are actually trying to draw a future for the region. I think we need to think about that seriously. Now, a lot is going to be, a lot of powers will stand against that, especially the current status quo authoritarian regimes, because eventually they demand or they see their interest in separation and in connecting themselves with powers either in the region like Israel or in the internationally like the United States of America. But with time, they will discover that these centers of power might not be able to save them from the, in my opinion, collapse that they're going to see if things continue as they are. And this is why a Sharq Forum has been trying now for years to sponsor this initiative of drawing a geopolitical and economic architecture in the region that could achieve a minimum stability when it comes to security, economics, and political legitimacy.
Thank you, Mr. Waddah. Yeah, the question, okay, response here, Dr. John, please.
Yes, just to add to Waddah Khanfa's remarks, it's very striking if you look at the last generation's global discussions of democracy, just how state-centric they are. You know, that the territorial mentality, democracy is infused with a territorial mentality. And its history was much more complicated and more interesting than that. That closure needs to be broken. And I very much agree that a geopolitical cross-border understanding of the spirit and substance of democracy is important. This also applies, I think, this principle applies to sub-territorial state levels. You know, cities are among the most interesting democratic laboratories globally at the moment. Networks among cities, initiatives to do with violence against women, web platforms, think tanks, public interest bodies such as Al-Sharq. I mean, these are contributions that defy that territorial mentality, and they're very important for sustaining, so to say, the unfinished democratic revolution of modern times.
Thank you, Dr. John. I have to apologize now to the people who sent their questions in the chat. Unfortunately, now we run out of time. So it was very a pleasure and a real honor to have three of you in this webinar. And I think we need many follow-up sessions, workshops to discuss most of the ideas that you mentioned here. But if I may end by saying something, it's about I feel that there's some sort of consensus that the Arab Spring is still there. It's a permanent quest for dignity, for democracy, for more legitimate regional order, more efficient state system. And I think this is something that we really need to approach the phenomenon of Arab Spring in its 10th anniversary with this lens. This is a continuous process, continuous quest for a more legitimate and efficient system in the region. Thank you, Mr. Waddah. Thank you, Dr. Larb Saddiqi and Dr. John Kean for joining us. And thank you for those who follow us on Zoom or on social media. And see you in the coming events for Sharp Forum. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you very much. Shukran.